started. Excellent. Thank you for helping me remember. Welcome to Wetlands Watch's Lunch and Learn series. We are glad that you've joined us, and we're looking forward to this presentation and the discussion that will follow, and we hope it'll be robust. We're thrilled to share with you all a project that Wetlands Watch has been working on with many, many different partners from across the state over the past year plus. So just a little bit over a year, we've been working on this endeavor, and we're going to share all about it with you today. So buckle up. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our organization's team, and we're going to do that by coming off of mute. Introduce myself first. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Mary-Carson. I'm the Executive Director of Wetlands Watch. And Shireen, if you don't mind going next, that'd be great.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Shireen Hughes. I'm Assistant Director of Wetlands Watch, actually the outgoing Assistant Director of Wetlands Watch.
Shireen is going to be stepping into an ambassador role at Wetlands Watch, only working 10 hours a week. So excited for her to have some time with her family. Stacie, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stacie McGraw. I'm the Green Infrastructure Programs Director for Wetlands Watch.
Great. Ian.
Ian T. Blair, Policy Program Director here at Wetlands Watch.
Okay. Gabby and then Jelani, please.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, my voice is a little struggling this morning because I'm under the weather, but Gabby Kinney, I'm the Community Engagement Project Manager at Wetlands Watch. Happy to be here.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jelani Sparrow. I am the Collaboratory Program Manager here at Wetlands Watch. Glad to be with you all.
And Will.
Hello, everyone. Happy lunch and learn hour for everyone. Will Eisenberg here, Coastal Planner in Virginia's Coastal Zone Management Program, who were the funders for this grant project.
Excellent. Okay, so for those people who have just joined, please introduce yourself in the chat. For those, if you can't see what other people have said, name, affiliation, and where you're calling or joining us from. So let's go ahead and get started. Thanks again for being here. And we're going to talk about this project that we've been working on that's all about how to help practitioners design living shorelines to be adaptive to sea level rise in Virginia. So I'm going to be presenting, as will Stacie McGraw, and then Will from the Coastal Zone Management Program will also be presenting as well. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this background. So I'm going to go into very quick kind of review of how we got here and why we're doing this. So we're going to talk about the 2020 legislation that was passed, that has brought great renewed attention to living shorelines in Virginia and its connection to climate change adaptation. Then we're going to talk about how that legislation was actually, made real through the release of guidelines in 2020, and why we're doing this, why Wetlands Watch cares, why you all should care, is because of the wetlands losses that we're experiencing in the Commonwealth. So let's get into it. All right. So for those of you who may remember, we in 2020. Then Senator Lewis passed legislation that basically said, hey, living shorelines, we know that they've been the preferred choice for shoreline erosion control in the past, but now we're going to up the ante and we're going to now require that living shorelines be used unless you can prove through the use of best available science that a living shoreline is not suitable for your property. So this is how things go in Maryland. They've passed the similar law that requires this default approach. And this is new for Virginia. So this is exciting, right? We want living shorelines. We want the co-benefits of having nature at the fringe of our shorelines. So default erosion control. Now, the bill did something else that I think is really important, and certainly important for the resource that we're going to be talking about today. Not only is our living shorelines the default approach now for erosion control, but the permits to do anything in this on the shoreline in the jurisdictional zone where tidal wetlands are protected, you must actually incorporate the standards that will be set by the Commonwealth. So this is where those guidelines come in, that will ensure protection of shorelines and sensitive coastal habitats from sea level rise and coastal hazards. So the law is directing the Virginia Marine Resources Commission to create these guidelines and minimum standards to ensure that everything that's permitted is going to protect our shorelines and coastal habitats from sea level rise and coastal hazards. So this is what it's doing. This is what the bill says. And what ended up occurring is that the state agency, VMRC, Virginia Marine Resources Commission, they took that directive and they created these guidelines. And these guidelines were voted on and approved and effective in 2021, effective as soon as they were approved. So the guidelines basically effectuated this standard that living shorelines are the default erosion control choice. And they specify a couple of things that are really important, right? Virginia Institute of Marine Science, they are the best available science arbiter. So remember, the provision says you have to put a living shoreline in unless best available science says that it's not suitable. So VIMS is going to be the end all be all for what is suitable or not. And this is an example of, like, if you have deep water and your property, there's no slope to speak of, and you're right next to some deep water, then a living shoreline doesn't make sense for that property. If you are in a cove with a ton of fetch or wind that's battering your shorelines, then plants may not last there as they're getting established. So that might be another example of why a living shoreline may not be suitable for a site. Okay, so if there's no living shoreline, so in those two examples that I just gave, then the guidelines state that the project, whatever's happening for erosion control on the site, must incorporate to the maximum extent possible elements of living shoreline approaches into those projects. So you got to put some living stuff in if you're going to do a riprap, a bulkhead, etc. So that's important, that I think gets lost in translation, that the guidelines now say. All right, so we got that default approach taken care of, check. Now the guidelines then are also going to focus on how these projects accommodate for sea level rise and coastal hazards. And this is what they say. The guidelines say that if you are going to design these living shorelines, they have to be functionally resilient and structurally designed to ensure they are, essentially dealing with and responding to the impacts of sea level rise, and specifically the impacts of sea level rise as projected through NOAA's intermediate high scenario curve. So this is the curve, for those of you who might not be aware, that the state has said they're going to use. And regionally, if you're in the Hampton Roads region, the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission has released curves that are pretty darn close to this intermediate high scenario. So this is the going standard, right, for Virginia, for what we think the water will be like in the future because of sea level rise. So got to use that standard. Then you also, in doing these living shorelines, have to ensure that the living shorelines are designed and constructed to mitigate coastal hazards, including storm level hydraulical energy that is reasonably expected over the useful life of the project. Okay, so it sounds very technical. What it basically says is your projects have to be able to stand some big wave energy, and that the wave energy is what's reasonably expected over how long you expect your living shoreline to be constructed. So that useful life becomes a pretty big indicator for how design works in the future. And we talk a lot about useful life in this design resource that we're talking about today. So then the guidelines go into detail for what specifically you have to look at in terms of those future conditions. So sea level rise and coastal hazards. And you have to look at different things according to what type of living shoreline you're installing. So this is not intended for you all to read this. It's just to show you that there are different components of an application to meet these guideline standards that need to be incorporated depending on what type of living shoreline you're going for. So this is in the resource. You don't have to pay attention to it. Okay, so that's the law, the guidelines, and why are we doing this? Why does this matter? So the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, which was released, about 3 years ago, revealed to us this shocking truth that we certainly knew from all of the good research that the Virginia Institute of Marine Science has conducted for decades, but became pretty scary and evident in the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. If we do not plan for the migration of wetlands or the persistence of wetlands, then we are looking at 89% wetlands loss by 2080. And so if we account for migrations to move landward under sea level rise conditions, then we can reduce this 89% loss projection to about 40% or 39%. So why is this the case? Well, wetlands can only grow a specific number, they can only grow at a specific rate in coastal Virginia. And that growth rate, which is a vertical growth rate, is slower than our sea level rise vertical growth rate. So what happens is the wetlands can't put enough sediment on top to kind of keep their place in the shoreline and in the water. And so the wetlands are drowning with that additional level of sea level rise that's stacking up with over time. So we got to plan for migration, and living shorelines are one way that we can do that. And we're going to talk about how they can be designed to accommodate for this big change. So with that, hand it over to Will to talk about CZM and why it's so great that they funded this project.
Yeah, thanks, MC. So yeah, just to kind of put this into context, Wetlands Watch had this project idea, but how it fit into what Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program does and where we put our funding, I just wanted to provide some context there. So for those of you who are unaware of what Virginia CZM is, we are what's called a networked program. So while we're housed with staff at the Department of Environmental Quality, we're actually made up of 12 different state agencies and then local governments who we have represented by the 8 coastal planning district commissions. So our actual program is all of those entities, and kind of the glue that holds us all together is the program funding that we provide for implementing programs and implementing projects with our networked agencies and local governments. Those agencies and local governments also have enforceable policies that they administer. This can be things like marine fisheries, wetlands, laws around that, like we're talking about today, but then also local land use ordinances and things of that nature. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, we have a lot of funding. That's the glue that kind of holds the whole program together. We also have a coastal policy team that really helps lead all of our decision making here, that's made up of all those different agencies and local governments, or PDCs. And so as a part of that, we do some strategic planning every 5 years to figure out, in addition to just implementing our programs, where do we need to address needs in the coastal zone? And when we identify those high priority needs, what strategies will help meet those needs? And so every 5 years, we do this Section 309 Coastal Needs Assessment and Strategies. We're actually going through that process right now for the next 5 years. But as a part of that, we had this coastal hazards goal that says enhance state and local capacity to adapt to the coastal hazards anticipated from climate change by evaluating and strengthening laws and policies. As a subset to that, we had a strategy to kind of help along the planning as it relates to shoreline management. So while we have projects related to these strategies already a part of this, every year NOAA opens up this opportunity for what they call a project of special merit. These are projects that meet that title and say, hey, this is a huge need that you have that kind of rises above the initial strategies you already have, pulls on lots of partners together, meets a critical need. And so when we put a poll out to all of our partners saying, hey, what types of projects are you thinking that might be able to meet some of these needs? MC and her team came to us with this project, noting that VMRC is definitely the agency administering these laws, these enforceable policies. They've developed the guidelines, but the community could benefit from having some case study examples that say, hey, if you're thinking about what this looks like in practice, here are some examples, here are some design strategies. So considering the strategy that we already had around coastal hazards and shoreline management planning, we thought this was a really good fit. And as this networked program, we were able to work really closely hand in hand with the whole team at Wetlands Watch, but in addition to VMRC, to really make sure that this was meeting the needs of the community and being something that could have a long lifespan and really provide a lot of value. So we've been really excited with the process that's gone on. It's pulled a lot of people and a lot of good conversations out of the woodwork, really advanced a lot of folks' understanding, mine included, in this realm, but also provides a really, really good resource that we're happy to see coming out on the back end. So with that, I will turn it back to you.
Great. And Stacie's going to talk about how we took on this big project and the need that it's filling.
Yeah, so before I dive into what's included in this resource, just take a moment to recognize all of the people who contributed to this. I'm not going to read all of their names, but we had a lot of great input from people on the work group. They represented multiple sectors, practitioners, researchers, regulatory, and put in a lot of time and effort to see this project through. So several of them I noticed coming in on the call. So thanks for being here today as well. Next slide. All right, so the process that we used to do this, we convened this work group and we had a series of meetings, 3 in person, 6 virtual. It did take a few more meetings than we had originally planned because the deeper, excuse me, the deeper we dove into this, the more questions arose. And so one of the benefits of this approach was that we had all of these different viewpoints in the room. And that let us really explore the concerns and priorities of all of these partners. We also held 5 locality listening sessions. So we wanted to hear about the local perspective of how these changes were being received in the communities, what those conversations looked like when Wetlands Board staff talked to designers or property owners, and what questions were there still out there about how to meet these standards. So took all of this input, drafted the document. It went through 5 revisions and review periods, and currently it is turned over to Greenfin for final formatting, and we expect final product very, very soon. So the resource is primarily for shoreline practitioners. That's the audience that we had in mind, that as they are designing projects, working with homeowners, property owners, that they would use this resource to help inform their designs, to ensure that we are taking the steps that will promote marsh migration or persistence over time. But other stakeholders will likely find this useful. Anybody who's dealing with coastal properties, whether they own it, they sell it, or they regulate it, NGOs who are doing cost share programs or outreach to property owners, to help them understand all of the multiple benefits that come from living shorelines, and the landscape professionals who are maintaining these, and the practices that they can implement, particularly in the realm of adaptive management, and taking care of these properties in the upland, the buffer and behind, and understanding the impacts of management decisions now on marshes of the future. Next slide. So what's included in this document? We did list some foundational resources. We did not attempt to recreate. There's so much great information already out there from partners like VIMS, that we didn't spend a lot of time or space going over some of those, but we did link to many. so that if someone picks this up and they are a little bit less familiar with how shorelines work, they would have easy access to that. Then we dug into some design considerations, those site-specific characteristics that impact the types of shoreline projects that can be installed, how likely they are to promote migration, or if other strategies need to be used. And then the work group developed a series of strategies that address both sea level rise and other coastal hazards. Those are detailed, and we'll talk a great deal about those just a little bit later. We do cover adaptive management, planning to monitor and keep these shorelines functioning, expanding that useful life as long as possible. The real meat of this document is going to be in the case studies. We've put together 26 real world examples that show those strategies in practice. And then, because the slide that Mary-Carson showed earlier that had all of the different requirements for the different types of permits, each one of those comes with a list of data that should be considered in making these decisions. And so we put together a table that makes it really easy to find the sources of that data and online tools that can be used to collect it. So the design strategies, they include these great icons that Greenfin developed, so they're easily recognizable throughout the document. It starts with what the strategy is, the methods for implementing that, and then gives a list of the case studies. Each case study will be linked in the strategies section. So if you are designing and you're looking for a reference site, you find the strategy that you think is going to work, you can go straight to those case studies from the strategy. Next slide. Again, the adaptive management section is really about planning for future action. How do we keep these shorelines functioning? How do we keep the marshes migrating over time? And the monitoring side of this is really looking for the indicators that more action is needed, keeping them maintained so that they are functioning as well as possible at any given point, and making sure that things like repairs are completed timely. The data and tools, I mentioned we've collected 20 different, a little bit more than 20 locations of the data that's required, that's listed in these guidelines, the BMRC guidelines, and where to find them, and just some of the examples of the type of data that's requested are erosion rates, fetch, the storm event levels, and some of the tools that we've linked to include the Adapt Virginia Viewer, Google Earth, alongside plugin tools that VIMS has created, and several databases that have some of this information. We pulled together 26 case studies. These were largely contributed by the work group. Our staff also did a deep dive into permitting records from BMRC, looking for actual projects that have been permitted and installed that designers could reference. They span a period of time a little over a decade, going back to 2012, all the way up to some newer ones that were installed this year. We endeavored to include a variety of energy environments, different types of structures and materials that were used, different levels of build out. So some are very simple, straightforward living shorelines that are very organic. Others required more robust structures in order to protect against wave energy. So we have a variety of those, as well as geography. We have both urban and rural examples. Those icons that Greenfin developed that are listed with each strategy are going to be repeated in these case studies. So you know what you're looking for. It can be an easy scan through to find projects that match. And we've formatted these as consistently as possible, trying to make sure that every one of them has the key information that a designer would need to use it as a reference. If you are all familiar with the spectrum of living shoreline projects, that isn't always possible, but we have tried our best. We do link to, there's an appendix where we provide links to the joint permit applications for each project. So if something, space or whatever the reason that something isn't included, you can go back to the source information very easily to find full documentation of each of these projects. All right, so the first design strategy that we're going to talk about is the one we knew going in, and that's that we need to create stable slopes that promote marsh migration. And this is really just creating that water to upland continuum that reduces vertical barriers that would impede the marsh from migrating landward. There are different ways to achieve this. A 10-to-1 slope is generally recommended through the literature that's come out of the research, but that's not always possible, particularly when you have space-constrained sites. So a somewhat steeper slope may be just as useful if those barriers to migration are removed. So we've pulled, you can go to the next slide. We've pulled an example case study from this just to show you the types of information that you're going to find when you dig into this document. So we've laid out the site parameters. These are what the designer of that project was dealing with when planning for this project. We've included a lot of the drawings, plan views, and profiles that kind of give you the insight into what this project looked like in the planning phase. You can go to the next slide. And then whenever we had them, we've included before and after photos and other supplemental photos of these projects to kind of show the result. Some of us need the visual, so you can see what these shorelines look like beforehand and then after projects were installed. And then I think MC is going to take the next couple.
Yes. So that is an example of our first design strategy. And so the review was a little bit more in depth. And now Stacie and I are going to alternate, and we're going to go through the remaining design strategies a little bit quicker with just a brief example with an image from one of the case studies. And then we'll wrap up and have time for Q&A and discussion. So that's kind of going to be how it goes. So we're not going to go into deep detail on each one. You'll have to wait for the report to dive in. So the second strategy is to design planting zones to plan for that migration of marshes. And so we're going to look at the Ryan Resilience Lab as the case study for this. And this, concept is that increasing the area of high marsh to create a much wider marsh edge is really the goal here. So if you are not familiar with the Ryan Resilience Lab, the Elizabeth River Project's new headquarters building in Norfolk on Knitting Mill Creek, which is a part of the Lafayette River, you need to go and check it out. Wetlands Watch helped design the legal instrument that requires that the structure on the property be demolished when that water overtakes the land. And so it's a really our shining example of adaptation of living shorelines to the max, right? So not all the projects are going to be like that, of course. However, this is a really a wonderful example of creating that focus on high marsh. And so the other kind of notable thing about this project is that, you know, it was designed for the intention of being an adaptive sea level rise, resilient living shoreline. It was one of the first to go through the process after the law changed. And Tim Strongberg from Strongberg, Garrigan Associates is the landscape architect that designed it. And it is just an excellent example. It also is one of our only, you know, one of our examples that really has a useful life of the living shoreline named and a number attached to it. And that's 50 years of a lifespan. So something interesting to note. Okay, second or third strategy, we have the elevation of marsh to persist in place, right? So we know that in some places, we will not be able to see our wetlands move landward because of obstructions, because of site considerations like homes and roads and the like. And so how can we figure out how to keep the elevation of marsh at pace with sea level rise? And that's really what the intent here is, right? So keep those ecosystem services flowing, keep that habitat maintained despite those changing sea level rise conditions. So this is a lot about designing the marsh to be higher at the start, but then also keeping it high through adaptive maintenance and adaptive management in the future. And so our case study here is Sarah Creek. Sarah Creek is in Hayes, Virginia, which is one of our, you know, great village communities in Gloucester. And this site is actually very close to Gloucester Point on Sarah Creek. And this project, as you can see here, had quite a lot of exposed mudflat. And the project included 128 cubic yards of sand to elevate the marsh to start. And we'll see how this project is maintained over time to keep that elevation of the marsh to, you know, at pace with sea level rise. Okay, I think this is you, Stacie.
So our next strategy really deals with wave attenuation, and it's increasing the marsh width to enhance that property of living shorelines, giving more space between the wave break and the upland for that energy to disperse and have less of an impact on the bank or anything else on the shore, particularly where we have infrastructure, homes, those types of things. So the case study that we highlight for this is the Captain Sinclair project, also in Gloucester. And you can see there are some structures behind, but this project used some breakwaters out in the front to expand that marsh, to widen all of that expanse. So now as waves come in, they're going to, at the very least, break on those structures, and then they have all of this increased marsh space for that energy to disperse before it risks impacting the bank kind of near the top of those piers or the buildings behind. And then kind of hand in hand with that is that sometimes you have to come below mean low water in order to place your sills so that there's enough space. If you have shallow near shore depths, then sometimes that's going to be the best strategy to use, is to kind of pull those sills out from the existing land fill behind to raise the elevation and create that stable slope that's gradually connecting the water's edge with the upland. It's not always possible. Either the site characteristics or navigation channels or other regulatory concerns may not make that a strategy that can be used everywhere. But it is where it can be used. It is effective in being able to stretch that marsh out, create that width, and achieve those stable slopes. So the case study for this is Money Point. They pulled the sill out just below mean low water. It's not very far out from there. And then they were able to fill behind, create this marsh. And at the top, there's actually also a berm incorporated that will help to deal with wave energy because it's still somewhat a constrained site. And there was some industrial pollutant concerns with this project as well. And then I think this is the last one that I will talk about. And again, this gets more to the coastal hazards, but really designing robust sills or breakwaters that are going to deal with that future anticipated storm energy, that energy that is likely. As far as the guidelines are concerned, they specifically call out the 10-year storm event. We looked at, over the course of developing this document, we looked at the feasibility of designing projects that would handle wave energy, storm surge levels on top of sea level rise levels for longer periods of time, 50 to 100 years. And that is not something that this document is really recommending. It may be appropriate for some projects, but we're really looking at somewhat shorter lifespans, up to maybe about 30 years, that we would want to plan for this. And so for the most part, that 10-year storm surge level is appropriate for that. And our case study is Jamestown Beach. This was developed by VHB, and it's a series of breakwaters that allowed beach to accumulate behind. So instead of sand washing away, getting caught in the littoral drift along the shoreline, as wave energy comes on shore and pushes sand to the sides, it's then caught by those breakwaters. And so elevations are maintained, vegetation is able to establish, and then those root systems further work to hold the sand in place and create this. Again, the whole point is to disperse wave energy before it can reach anything in the upland.
Okay, so I'm going to discuss the last two strategies that are in the document. The first being the strategy to use multiple nature-based solutions to reduce erosion. So this is one that I feel like everybody can really get behind, right? So if you have the ability to use nature to combat this change that we're experiencing, that should be a priority. So specifically in the living shoreline space, we're talking about oysters, and the example that we have is about oysters as well. So if if the site conditions are favorable for the use of oysters, and specifically the use of oyster recruitment, so the increase of the presence of oysters, then the document advises that using oyster structures or using sills that are made out of materials that will allow for oysters to have the maximum chance of survival and of recruitment, then that's a really good idea. With water levels changing, oysters, they are adaptive, right? They're naturally adaptive. And so as water increases on a site, those oysters will move with the land, just like the habitat that they're living in, the plant species. So we're going to look at cases where there is the use of oyster material and other nature-based materials to design your living shorelines. So the example that we have here is Newport Crescent, an example from Norfolk, also on the Lafayette River. This was designed in 2022 in a partnership between CBF and Chesapeake Bay Foundation and the Elizabeth River Project. And I think that Sue is actually on the call. So Sue, you'll see a lot of your pictures throughout this presentation. This project included a bulkhead removal in part of the site and used a lot of the existing oyster shells that were on site in this before photo, and the addition of 200 loose oyster shells that were also used to actually stabilize the shoreline. This project included the use of core logs, with 80 of these wooden stake features here that are keeping the core logs in place, as well as the new sand that was used and the new wetland species. So 200, when I said 200, I meant 200 bushels. So I hope I didn't misspeak. So quite a lot of oysters used here. So the core logs are going to be a nice material for the oysters to attach to, and even recruitment on the wood stakes is possible. So this is a great example of how to use multiple nature-based solutions to reduce erosion on the site with your nice wetlands plants behind, including a little bit of a vegetated buffer here on this small residential property. Finally, the last design strategy that we have in the report is to stabilize slopes to reduce erosion from wave energy. This is an obvious one, right? So you want to keep your slopes as happy and functioning as possible, so that as erosive forces such as wave energy occur, you don't lose that land. So we're going to talk about a project that was designed in 2022 on Nassawattix Creek, and this is on the Eastern Shore in Northampton County. And this property is actually Jane Batten, who certainly wouldn't mind us saying so. She's a wonderful environmentalist and philanthropist. And so she has a property that's on the Eastern Shore that has a lot of issues with erosion. And the shoreline kind of creeps around and has lots of different characteristics. But the project with VHB was to essentially create these marsh terraces. And so it's hard to see them in this image, but the creation of kind of like false marsh fringe or man-made marsh fringe with a lot of stone stills that are going to help with battling that wave energy, and a lot of marsh created in that backshore planting terraces. So this is about 40,000 square feet of marsh creation. So a massive project, and certainly one to look at. All right, back to you, Stacie.
All right, so that's kind of our overview of what the document includes, a little bit about how to use it. So how are you going to get it? As soon as we have the final polished version, we're going to post it on our website, somewhere where it's easy to find. We're also going to email the doc to everybody who is on the call today. And then it will also be linked in our end of year newsletter. We're hopeful that partners, people who participated on the work group, will also be distributing this through their websites, linking back to our page. And we're happy to connect and answer any other questions that anybody has. We are open to all kinds of outreach, as well as presenting on this throughout the future. Our grant period with CZM is coming to a close, but I think it's obvious that this project really speaks to the mission of Wetlands Watch. So we are not abandoning the work just because the grant period is done. This is going to be an ongoing effort on our part. So the next steps for us, we intend for this to be a living document. There are going to be more projects. There have been more projects installed since we started working on this. We want to be able to kind of keep up to date, and as good case studies become available, continue to compile those so that they're easily accessible to the practitioner community who is looking for those reference sites. To that effort, we are working on a dedicated web page that will house all of this. We hope that that will include a searchable database of case studies where you would be able to put in maybe your top 3 site parameters and then just pull up a list. Right now, the case studies are only 26. It's not too tedious to kind of go through, glance, look for the different icons that indicate strategies. But as that list grows, we need to accommodate for that. And then we have also, working with Greenfin, created some summary docs for those stakeholder groups that we mentioned earlier. Those non-practitioners or perhaps different type practitioners, to just provide some framing for those communities for how this document applies to them, as well as some benefits of living shorelines. So still promoting the use of that as a shoreline strategy, even in situations where maybe all of these future facing strategies can't apply. Living shorelines are still the best option to provide a chance for migration and survivability of our marshes. And now it's time for all of your questions.
And Shireen's going to be our Q&A moderator. Thanks, Shireen.
Certainly. Okay, first question is from Sue Mangan, who also said this is great, a great resource. But her question is about maintenance guidelines. Are those as clear with the various types of installations?
Go ahead, Stacie.
Yeah, I'm thinking the maintenance recommendations are really more generalized because the document speaks to such a wide variety of strategies and approaches to shorelines. Designers are generally thinking about maintenance when they plan projects, and as property owners should be asking for really specific information for your site. And I think most designers and or installers would be able to provide that for you.
Yeah, and I would just say that Sue, when the case studies had a kind of reference to, or when the applicant or designer, we knew that that was something that they were considering, then we've included those in the case studies. But if there wasn't something specific, it is not included. But there is a section in the document about maintenance with a couple suggestions. It's just not with the same specificity.
Okay, next question from Kate Wilson. How do you envision contractors and businesses will learn about these projects and use the resources?
Well, today's kind of the first step. It's actually the second step. We presented on this project at the Living Shoreline Collaborative's annual summit back in October. That group involves a lot of outreach to contractors. We're going to be incorporating this into, we didn't mention before, but Wetlands Watch is also the Virginia coordinator for the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program. And we have a training program that we developed with the Living Shoreline Collaborative over the last several years that speaks directly to contractors. So we will be incorporating this as a key reference into that course, and are on the lookout for any and all opportunities to expand the outreach to all of the different types of communities that could benefit from this.
And I think we had about 60 plus people attend those CBLP Shorelines workshops. So that's the initial cohort, as well as Chesapeake Bay Foundation has a listserv that they maintain about living shorelines. So that's another way we can expand the outreach. Jim
And-
Milliken.
Let me just add, Shereen.
Yes.
You know, if you're on this call and you have a contractor like pop it into your head that like, oh, they should see this, you're going to get a copy emailed directly to your inbox. Please share widely with anybody that you feel would benefit from this or find it useful.
Great. Jim Milliken asks, how has research been done on costs of adaptive management long term?
To our knowledge, it hasn't. And that I think that, you know, to kind of take it high level again, this is so new. And the idea of having these considerations be mandated at the state level it has brought up so many kind of nuanced issues that we, you know, that haven't been discussed in a kind of in an organized way. And so we don't have good data, and we don't have good guidance. And and that's one of the reasons why the project was identified as a good idea in the first place, because, you know, there weren't really, we of course had wonderful documents that VIMS had created that talk about how living shorelines will change over time due to sea level rise. But the impetus for this is really to get the conversation started. And so hopefully, as these projects are observed over time, there will be some hub of information that we can all pull from in looking at projects in the future, so that a property owner could have some sense of what they should anticipate. I think normal losses and maintenance is certainly data that we do have. It's just, how does the adaptive, how do these bigger changes factor in? And we just don't really know.
Yeah, and I would add to that that monitoring is really going to be the first step in collecting that data. And I know Karen Dury was on this call. I'm not sure if she's still with us from VIMS, but she has been leading the monitoring action team for the Living Shoreline Collaborative for a number of years. And they have developed a new app called ShoreWatch that is really designed to kind of standardize how shoreline projects are monitored, so that that database of information will start being built, so that we have a good starting point to try to answer some of these questions.
Oh, good, Karen.
And I would like to add also that the shoreline case studies, a couple of them have adaptive management plans built in, monitoring and adaptive management plans built in order to allow them to be adapted to sea level rise over time as you start seeing changes in vegetation, for instance. So I would also say that just like everything else about this, we're still learning, but we have built in some plans. And as those plans are implemented, I think we'll have a better idea of the costs. And then there has always been the goal of training more landscape professionals who are already working along the shoreline, doing just traditional landscaping along the shoreline, to incorporate a lot of this into their services. And so it's not a huge uplift to add these to their services when they're already there on the site.
Great point. Were there any other questions, Shereen?
I don't see any other questions.
We'll end early. If there aren't any other questions, give you 3 minutes back of your life. Thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar. We will make the recording available to all of the attendees. It'll also be on our website and on our YouTube page, so you can refer back to it then. If you've registered and are attending, then you're going to get an email with this document directly, but then we will also be sending it out in the avenues that Stacie discussed. And so expect to see it floating around for, I hope, a long time. And stay tuned on how it changes and gets updated over time. But thank you for your interest in this issue, and we hope that you have a wonderful holiday season. Bye, people.